So back on the AWS Management Console, we are going to use a server called Elastic Beanstalk. That is basically a service that makes deploying websites and web applications very simple. Once you're there, you can click on Create Application and then choose any name of your choice here. And I'm going to go with Django-blog, but the name is up to you. Now, further down on Choose Platform, choose Python, of course, since we're going to run a Django app and that is a Python app in the end. Now, if we scroll down further, we now need to provide our application code. And here I want to upload my own code, of course, and that means that we now need to prepare our code. So this project code. And that's now where things get interesting. Here we now need to combine a bunch of those folders and files into a zip file, but we also need to add a new folder first. And that's the .eb extensions folder. Now, that's a folder specifically for Elastic Beanstalk. But no matter which hosting provider you choose, there will always be some hosting provider specific options. Now, in that folder, in this .eb extensions folder, we need to add a django.config file. And in this django.config file, you should add some settings. Not too much though. For this, write option_settings, and make sure you have no typos in here. Any typo you will have in here will basically lead to your application not working. So add option settings here, then enter a new line and add 2 blanks, so hit space twice, and then add AWS : Elastic Beanstalk : container : Python : Again, double check for typos. You also find the finished config file attached though. Then again, enter a new line and 2 blanks, and then type wsgi path, and make sure you got the casing right, : white space my_site .wsgi : application. Now, here it's important that you use your project folder name, so specifically the folder in your project which carries your project name, my_site, and that of course is the folder which has the wsgi file, which I mentioned would become important for deployment. We're pointing at this file here, basically telling Elastic Beanstalk that this will be our entry file to which any requests should be forwarded. So in here, we then have this application key, and that's in the end what we point at here. And therefore, all this config file does in the end is it tells Elastic Beanstalk that incoming requests should be forwarded to that file and that Python object in there. Then save this file, and now we need to create a zip file of all the content which should be deployed. Now for this, it's easiest if you open your project folder, the My Site folder here in my case, with your regular Windows Explorer or Mac Finder. And now let's make sure that we deploy the correct folders. For this, don't zip the entire project folder. That would be wrong and it would not work. Instead, manually select the folders and files that need to be deployed. And that would be the Uploads folder, the Templates folder, the Static Files folder, which contains our collected static files, not the static folder, because we just need the Static Files folder with the collected static files. Then Requirements text, that's required for Elastic Beanstalk to install the correct packages. Our project folder, Manage PY, our database file, which already contains some data, which is important here, our blog app folder, and the .eb extensions folder. And for this, of course, make sure that you can view hidden files. With those folders and files selected, zip them, so convert them into a zip file and name the file however you want. And with that created, back on the AWS console, choose that file you just created. So here I'm choosing my code zip file, which I just created, and now that file is getting uploaded here. Once this did upload successfully, don't click Create Application, but click on Configure More Options. And now here, you can leave all those defaults, especially the single instance default, to make sure that you're eligible for this free tier and it doesn't cost you anything. But then let's go to Software. And here in the software part, we can generally leave all the defaults here as well, but then we got these environment properties. Now keep any default properties you might have here, but now here, we can add those environment variables which we added and which we require in our application and plug in concrete values for them. Specifically in my case, that means that I need to provide a value for isProduction, and I'll set this to true here. And that I need a value for app host. And that should be the actual domain for this application. So the domain which will be used for hosting this application. The problem is that in this case, I don't know it yet. But that will only be the case when we deploy this for the first time. Sometimes you, of course, also know the domain you want to bind your application to in advance, but here I don't. So I'll just add a placeholder, a dummy here for the moment, and I'll replace this with the actual value in a second. Now click Save here. And once you did that, you can leave all the other settings also as they are. You don't need to change anything there unless you know what you're doing. We also don't need to change anything on the database here because for the moment we're still using SQLite. So therefore now let's click on Create App. And now what this does is it creates a server for you, it moves your code onto that server, it sets up Python and installs all the packages, and it will then start a web server which forwards requests to your Django application. Now this can take a couple of minutes, and I will be back once it's done. Now after a while, it should be live and you should see a screen like this. If you don't see OK here, then you might have an error in your config file or something like this. So definitely check all the deployment steps in great detail then. Make sure your config is correct, that you picked the right folders and files for your zip file, and so on. Now if you click this link here, you're taken to your page and it crashes here. It crashes here because we have an invalid HTTP host header. I also see that I still get a detailed debug output, and the reason for this is that I messed up this isProduction environment variable. That should be the isDevelopment environment variable, and true should be the default, and when we deploy it, I should set it to false. I did set it to true a couple of seconds ago because I named it isProduction. So I confused myself here. We want to name it isDevelopment so that in production we set it to false, because we are not in development, so that debug is set to false in production, because that's what we need here. So that's another mistake from my side, which I now fixed. But the error we get here has nothing to do with that. That's actually an expected error, because the domain, which is used for serving our application, is not added to allowed hosts. And we need to add it to allowed hosts. Now, I was not able to do that before, because I didn't know the domain that would be assigned to us in advance. Now I do know it. Side note, you can of course also connect your own domain. You can also enable SSL, but these are topics I'll dive in later. So for the moment, we now at least know our domain. So I can copy this domain and go back to my configuration, and then here go to Software again, to the environment properties, and now I'll set isProduction to false, which is wrong, but I'm still using the isProduction key here, and as I explained a couple of seconds ago, that simply was the wrong name I picked, but false is the value we want here for debug. And I'll now set app host to this concrete domain, which I now know, so to my concrete address here. And we don't need to add the HTTP part, we really just need the domain name like this, without any slashes or HTTP. And then click Apply. And now this is applied, and our deployment is updated. So let's wait for this update process to finish here. So now the updating finished, and if we now visit this again, this looks way better. And now we see our application, as we built it, but running in the web. And we can also visit the admin area, of course, and there log in with our credentials, which we set up locally, and we can manage our data here, and we can do everything we tested locally, but now here in our deployed application. So that all works just as we set it up over the last lectures and throughout this course, but now it's deployed. And therefore now that's the base workflow for deployment. Now I want to dive into custom domains and SSL. Before thereafter, we're going to have a look at using a different database and managing our static files differently.